We're so privileged this morning to have Bob, and it's really exciting because normally we have our kind of a Thomas family reunion, and I usually have to study during that time to prepare for speaking. And so Bob calls up and he says, "Hey, I'm in the area on the 21st," and he said, "Would you like me to speak?" And I thought, wow, this is a tremendous blessing. So the real answer, and so I said, "Yeah, we sure would." So anyway, it's exciting to have Bob here. I think you've had 2 family camps, haven't you? 2 different family camps, and he's a former pastor of Andy. And so after Andy went to Africa, then Bob pursued him to Africa. So then he was working with Andy, and he went and developed a whole teaching from Genesis to Revelation for the pastors up there that basically a lot of them didn't have any Bibles. They didn't have anything to go from except the health and wealth doctrine that was being pushed out over the air. And that's what they heard, and that's what they preached. And so they got kind of squared away through the teachings, and it was exciting because it was very dramatic, as you can imagine what African people are like. They're very dramatic, and Bob was very dramatic, and they got better than him. But he is such a good teacher. Anyway, they went through that, what, a 2-year course or 3-year?
It's a 2-year course.
2-year course. They've got quite a few pastors now have gone through that course. Many have actually gone through that course.
How many sessions, Bob? How many groups now?
Have we had gone through? There's probably been 8, 10 groups, I think now.
Yeah, anyway, it's been powerful. It's been wonderful. And then anyway, he went from there with Shem to global outreach, which is kind of what a controlling factor of Shem.
They're over.
Yeah, they're over the whole thing. So anyway, Bob's now over the whole thing, or sort of. I don't know how that. Anyway, so we're excited this morning to just be able to have Bob here to speak, and I know that we're all going to be very encouraged by the word that's given this morning. So I'll turn it over to you, Bob, and God bless you.
All right. Is this on?
I think so.
All right. I do have a tendency to wander, so I appreciate that.
Can you take these chairs out of the way?
Well, I actually probably move them along as I'm going. That's okay. In fact, I'm going to move this just a little bit over there. It is a thrill to come back here. Meagher has been, not only are they one of our supporting churches, and we want to express our appreciation and gratitude for both the prayers and financial support through the years, and we are truly blessed with that. We've been blessed by Andy and Karina, especially getting to be with them both when I was pastoring. Andy was my associate pastor for about 8-9 years over at Duffer, where we were there together, and then as we served there in Uganda together. It was a true blessing. And yeah, the beauty of the training program is that the whole goal was, and it's usually the missionary goal, to be able to get it going and turn it over into the hands of the nationals. And we were blessed with some truly great men of God there, and women of God, that we were able then to turn it over, and now they are the ones who are training other pastors. And so it's been a blessing. While we were there, as we got into Africa, it wasn't that long as I was involved with pastoral training, that God put upon my heart the missionaries in the area. There were quite a few missionaries that were going out in different areas in our area, and what we saw was a lot of them were struggling. There was a lot of pressure. That one of the things we find that the stress level is about 3 times on average what it would be if they were living here in the States for the family that lives and it begins really to wear on marriages, wear on missionaries, and God began to put upon my heart the time to begin pastoring actually missionaries. And so we got more and more involved with that while we were still training the pastors. We began traveling, checking up on our missionaries, seeing how they got going. With Global then, about 3 years ago, Global asked me to come back and to head up the missionary care for the entire organization. Building a team, training a team to go out and visit and build relationships with our people, to keep them, because we found a lot of our people, the missionaries, were burning out. Some of them were returning early. They'd only last a few years. But more important than just the work not going, we saw families and people that had given their lives to the Lord and now are coming back broken. And it has crushed our heart to see a passion of someone like that, and then just to see what it could do on their family. So for the last 3 years, I've been the director of missionary care for our organization. We've built it up, and that's been good, but now my God was getting more into administration, and to tell you the truth, that's just not where my heart is. And so just recently, I've stepped down from that position to focus on getting back to more hands-on with our missionaries. We're focusing now on what we call debriefs. How many of you heard about debriefs? Okay, a few over there. Debriefs was actually started by the military. It was started really in the Gulf War. They began to find, they had actually a reporter that went in and she just wanted to start getting stories. And so she began to talking with some of the different ones who had come off of combat missions. And what they found is that the soldiers who came back and talked through their experiences had a tendency to do much better later on. They slept better, they performed better, that they did a lot better. And so they began to develop a whole program of having their soldiers talk through what they've been through. Seeing the results, mission organizations said, hey, we need this for our people. We need to give them a chance to talk through all the trauma and the stresses and everything that goes through their lives. And so we began doing that. And as I was with our organization, with the member care, we found that to be one of our most useful tools in helping families. And so now that's where we're going to come back and to focus primarily on that. Michelle and I are going to work with a few others, trying to use a debriefing program. One of the ones we found most useful was a week-long one, where they would come back and you would work through them. Now there are different organizations that do some of that stuff. Some are even 2 or 3 weeks, and they're really good, but they also tend to be very expensive. They tend to be around $2,000 to $3,000 a person, because they've got to afford the facilities, the people, the food, and all that kind of stuff. And what we were finding is that even though we would tell our people, we would see families that were struggling, that were dealing with the stress and dealing with the pressures, and we say, you guys really need to get a debriefing. And just to talk through this, and they were going, yeah, we would really like it, but we can't afford it. We can't take a whole family and spend thousands of dollars like that. So our goal now is to try to figure out how we can make debriefing affordable and even maybe portable, so that we can go some different places around the world. We raise our own funds to pay for our salary and that, so that it doesn't cost them near as much, so that their families can do that. And that's what we're involved of that. Now, some of that is a little hard to visualize as we're talking about it, so I'm gonna look for a volunteer. Can I have you come up and volunteer for Mark? No, don't turn around. Yep, that's you. Your name. What's your name? Huh? Ken? Good man, Ken. Have a seat right there. I'm going to focus just on one area. When we do a debrief, what we often do is that we will talk over the last year or so or two of their life, and we're going to look at different areas. And just one of the areas that we're going to look at is losses. Okay, different losses. Now, losses come generally in 2 areas. One is losses that comes from our choices. Ken, is that right? Ken, did it? Okay, got it right there. Ken here, for instance, in order for him to be able to do what I asked him to do, it involved loss. He had to leave his spot. He had to leave security. He doesn't know what I'm going to ask him to do. I might ask him to do a ballet dance or something, but he didn't know. And yeah, he's going up there, so it's a little nervous, you know, and especially if you thought about if I told him, well, this is where you're going to sit every Sunday from now on. You're going to sit right up there and do that. It involves security, involves different losses in different areas, and we see that. There's a second type of loss that isn't involved with choices that we make voluntarily. Can you stand up? Thank you. The second type of loss involves when something you're relying upon something that you're resting upon, is taken from you. And it leaves you kind of left hanging. You're not sure what to do. You're not sure where to go, because you have it taken from you. You feel vulnerable. You feel in a very awkward spot. Thank you, kid. You go ahead and sit down. With our missionaries, they see both of those. When they leave, they have losses. They lose family connection, they lose the opportunities, they lose comfort. They're no longer in a place, they're sitting out front. My kids, you know, they didn't fit into the African culture very well. They kind of stuck out. You can't hide anymore. You're right out in front. When missionaries go, they are usually aware of that. They know that going. But it's often a lot of the little things that they're not aware of that begins to catch up with them, that begins to come along. One of the losses that actually hit me, I didn't find this out until I came back and was debriefed. One of the losses that hit me the hardest was how I fathered my children. My father was a great man. He was a good man. But he was kind of a workaholic. And he didn't really have time for me. I was the youngest. And so he didn't come to my games. He didn't come to those type of things. He would have liked to, but you know, he couldn't. And as I had children, I would say, I'm going to try to do better. I'm going to try to be a good father to my kids. And I'm human. There's a lot of times I wasn't doing exactly. I was wasteful time and that stuff. But I was going to be at their games, boy howdy. I was going to be at those events with that. And when we were at Doofer, I was coaching Little League and that kind of stuff and being with my kids and stuff. But when we went to Africa, that changed things. They didn't have those kind of events going on. And as our kids got to high school, educational challenges of where you're going to educate your kid is a big challenge for our missionaries. And with our area, there wasn't anything really good, so we felt best to send them off to boarding school in the country next to us, Kenya. Our kids actually loved it there. It was a great school, but as parents, I could not go to the games. I could not go to their prom. I could not go to those things. It was a good day's journey, and there were times when we would go, Michelle and I, my wife, we actually said, okay, we're going to take these next few days and we're going to travel over there and we're going to see my two younger boys were in rugby. And we're going to go see one of their games and we're going to cheer them on. But unfortunately, it's Africa. And so we packed up, we drove over there all the way, spent that time going and traveling that. And we get there and the African team had canceled. So we tried that 3 times, and every time the other team just didn't show up. Now, we just said, well, that's just the way it is. That's just what is involved with the choices we make. But when I got back and began debriefing about that and began looking about where I am there, I just broke down and cried. Because I couldn't do what I wanted, but it came from choices that we made. They cost. And I'll talk about dealing with them in just a moment. The other type of chances of things taken from you is very common there. You guys have it here too. But for instance, theft and stuff was extremely common in Uganda. We had actually a wall around our house, and we had dogs that barked. They weren't really guard dogs, but they barked. And we actually had a security guard, a guy that stayed there. There was 24 hours. We had someone around. And even with that, our property was broken into half dozen times the time we were there. They didn't actually find to get into the houses because we had bars and we had everything going on there. But it was just a reality of life. You went out and you always, always had to be aware because the possibility was there. We had a house that it was nice for there, but the best thing for us was a yard. There was a big yard, this fence, and we had our kids, that at that time they were like from 8 to 13, and it had a big yard. There was lots of trees in it, and our kids could go and play. And it was a place we could come in a little bit and feel a little secure. And then a recession came through here a number of years ago, and we're depending, of course, on people's support. And within the beginning of 1 year, 25%, 1/4 of our support just went away. And we went from having a bit of a cushion to having not even being able to take a salary for a month, and even not really being able to afford to come home. And we had to leave that home. We were renting. And we moved on to a property where I was teaching in a seminary, and we were now right in the middle of the Nationals clothesline was right outside one window, and there are all the schools, right? And we were in a fishbowl, and there was no place for the kids to play. They could, and my wife went into a bit of a depression for a while. And it wasn't until she went somewhere and so they talked through and realized she had not grieved that loss. That was a loss like something dying. That's her home for her family. Those are type of the losses that we're talking about. Now, for those in the mission field, often the feeling is, well, that's just a part of what it is. And so you go on. Everybody has them. But the problem with that is that when you do that, when you just kind of put them behind you, and that's what missionaries usually do, is that they tend to stick with you wherever you go. And those problems, they just kind of tag along with you. Now you can function with that. You can keep going, but one loss adds to another loss, adds to another loss, adds to another loss. And soon you've got a whole stack that you're pulling around. And it gives you to a point where it's hard to even go forward. We found a lot of our people doing that. What do you do with losses? I'm just going through one aspect of debriefing here for you. Well, first off, you have to acknowledge it's there. And so that would be one thing we would do is we'd look over. What were some of the losses that you have faced over the last couple of years? And to look at them and realize that as you look at a loss, each loss needs to be grieved. If you just stick it behind you, if you just go ahead and ignore it and put it back there, it's just going to mount. But we have to be willing to help our people to go through it. And some of you know kind of the grief cycle where the first is denial or shock, and then denial, and then anger, and then you're bargaining. And you can't read all that. It's okay. I'm not going to really go through that with you. But just the process is to understand one of the we have to do is help our people go through each of those losses and say, where are you with that? Is it something you're still denying? Is it something you're still it makes you angry? Is it something you're still bargaining with God with? God, if you'll just do this, then I'll do this. Or have you come to a point of saying, yeah, it was there, and it hurt, but I'm going on from that. And so we have to help our people work through those things and begin to look at all the different ones and say, where are you at with this? And how are you dealing with that? So that's just a process. That's one aspect of what debriefing is. It's helping them tell their story and learning how to ask questions, how to be able to bring out, help them to work through that and giving them the time and space and the place where it's safe to work through that. That's what we're doing. When I usually go and I speak at a place, I want to share some of what we're doing. But I also, when I come, I want to ask God, say, what is it you want me to share with these people? Because you are just as valuable and just as precious to Him. And so this morning now, I'd like to shift a little bit about what God has put upon my heart to share with those around. And it involves the area of guilt and shame and grace. Guilt, guilt is one of the things our missionaries deal with a lot too. I mean, they're people, they do things that aren't right, but a lot of them actually deal with guilt connected with expectations. There is this expectation both they put on themselves and that others, maybe those supporting them, they may not mean to, but there's that idea you're going to go out there and you're going to be a hero and you're going to be reaching to people and doing these wonderful things. And they get over there and they find, it's just hard living there sometimes. And sometimes things don't always work out as you like. And there's this pressure of I am not what I want to be. And the weight of that guilt can begin to press upon it. Guilt is one of Satan's biggest tools. And you know it very well, because it hits all of us. It is something all of us have dealt with. The times that we haven't maybe made where we wanted to, or maybe we have done something we were ashamed of, or maybe it's just we look at ourselves and feel that we should be here, this is where we want to be, and we see ourselves down here, and it begins to shake us. It takes away our confidence. Sometimes we wonder just how God can use somebody like me. That even God can actually care for somebody like me. I'd like to look at a passage of Scripture where we have someone who is dealing with guilt. This passage of Scripture is in John chapter 8. This is a story I'm sure you're familiar with. We'll begin here. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives early in the morning, and he came again to the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. Okay, so it tells us Jesus has gone to the temple. Now, the temple area was a very big area, and it had what we call the court of the Gentiles, or court of the nations, or peoples, or whatever. And this is a very large, it doesn't look large here, but we're talking a couple acres. This is a big area that they have around here. And all the way around it, at Herod's temple, where Jesus was using, was what they call these portici, or portico. It's basically a covered area. They have these pillars, and it's covered, it gives them shade. And it's around these areas that the rabbis would often have their classes, their disciples would meet in these covered shaded areas, and that's where they would teach. And Jesus, as a rabbi, he was meeting in the temple area, in the courtyard with them. So we find that's what Jesus was doing. And that's where the story takes it with. It says, the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, having set her in the center of the court. They said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery, in the very act. Now the law of Moses demands us to stone such a woman. What then do you say? They were saying this to test him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down with his finger and wrote on the ground. Okay, so there's this gal. She has been caught in the act of adultery. The law and D-law, Moses says it ain't that way. Now, the law actually says both, whoever's involved in it, but needs to be stoned. Okay, and that means they would be taken to an area, and then they would throw rocks. People would gather around them and throw rocks on them until they died. They would throw big rocks, not little rocks. Aspect. So, the scribes and Pharisees, the conservative aspect of the Jewish nation, they have this woman. Now, in Jesus' time, they didn't usually stone people like that very much, sometimes, but it was a less common thing. A couple reasons. One is because the people saw it as being too harsh, and so just as we see in our culture where things get accepted more, they didn't usually do this, and because at this time the Jews were under the authority of the Romans. And the Romans would let the Jews have their own court system, but what they denied them was the ability to cast death sentences. So if they could do that, cast a death sentence, but they would have to go to the Romans to actually have that death sentence carried out. They were not supposed to carry it out themselves. So the Jewish authorities who have this woman, they're not sure what are they going to do with this woman. All right, she's caught. What are we going to do with her? And then one of them, someone that comes up with this great idea. I know. Let's take her to Jesus. Because they think this is the perfect thing for them. They've been trying to find ways of capturing or tricking Jesus to get himself into trouble. And here we have a perfect opportunity. Because here we have this woman, and the law clearly says that if someone who's caught doing this, they are to be stoned. So there it is right there. So if we take her to Jesus and he says, oh no, don't do that, well, they could then accuse him of being an unbiblical teacher. Or if he says, well, yes, let's go ahead and stone her, then they could then take him to the Romans and say, look, he's teaching going against your laws. So it's like a lose-lose situation. They think, we got him. We can take him and Jesus is stuck. So they bring this gal to Jesus and they present the case and they say, well, what do you say? And Jesus does exactly what they don't intend him to do. First off, he just ignores them. First he starts writing, but then it says, they persisted in asking him, and he straightened up and said to them, he who's without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Again, he dropped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the old ones. And he was left alone, and the woman, and where she was, in the center of the court. Okay. Jesus is, of course, Jesus is Jesus. He's brilliant. He's God. And what he does is, to deal with the situation, he just flips it back on her. He doesn't deny that she was guilty. Doesn't deny that the law says it should be stoned. He just says, okay, all right, she's guilty. But you who are without sin, you go ahead and you throw the stone. See, he now is putting it in their position. They are the ones who are deciding whether or not she's going to die or not. Now, they have to, first off, he knows they can't, because to claim that they're sinless, that goes against the law of Moses, and we're told that they are. And so they would have to claim that. And even if they did, they would go against the Rome. So, and he's now flipped back on them. And the older ones, they recognize it first, and they take off. And then we have Jesus, of course, we finish up the story. And straightening up, Jesus said to her, woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? And Jesus said, no, Lord. And Jesus said, I do not condemn you either. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Okay, so we have this story of Jesus showing his, obviously, superiority against the rulers and showing graciousness to this woman. One question that is often a lot of people who have often asked is, what was he doing writing on the ground? What was he doing? I mean, they come and they ask him, and he doesn't respond to them. He just sits down there, and there's dirt. Whether they're in the courtyard, so it's probably paved, but there's dirt on it there. And so he's just writing in the dirt. What in the world is Jesus doing writing on the ground there? Scholars for years have tried to guess what might he be doing. What was he doing? And you hear different ideas, and ones that maybe while he was doing it, he was writing out maybe the names of the men that were there, maybe show that he knows them too, or maybe he was writing out their sins to show that they actually were, but we don't really know. I now believe that what he was writing really had nothing to do with those men. I believe it had everything to do with that woman. Now, why do I think that? I haven't thought. For years I just thought, I don't know what he's doing. Well, just knowing Jesus' pattern, he usually focuses on the one most in need. He doesn't necessarily worry about those who are shouting. He focuses on the one, whether it's the leper or whether it's the one who needs healing, and who would be the most in need in that crowd? It would be that woman who the crowd is now turned against. So maybe that part. Other aspect of just the practical. If Jesus bent down and began writing, if I began writing here in this dirt, what did I just write? You couldn't see what I wrote, because you're out there, and I'm right here. Unless Jesus was writing in big letters, if you're more than a few feet away from him, you're not going to be able to tell what he's doing. In fact, John, who tells us is one of his disciples, who is very close to their Jesus, he doesn't know what Jesus wrote. He just tells us Jesus wrote in the dirt. I don't know what he wrote, but he wrote in the dirt. Who would be the one who could most easily see what Jesus was writing in the dirt? The woman right beside him in front of him. So logically, I can kind of go that way, but to tell you the truth, I didn't come to this conclusion logically. I came to this conclusion a few months ago because of something God showed me. A few months ago, I woke up in the middle of the night. And looking back now, I knew what was going on. I can tell what was going on. It was a spiritual attack. That happens sometimes. And this spiritual attack took the form of this tremendous wave of guilt that just came over me. I just woke up and I just felt it was as if there was a mountain pressing on my chest. And there was this voice that was in my head of how worthless and how how much of a poor Christian that I was, and how it was just overwhelming. That's one of the ways you can kind of usually tell a spiritual attack besides anything, is that usually it's way overboard when Satan really hits you with something, whether it's fear or something like that. But I didn't know it at the time. All I knew was, I felt this wave of guilt and shame, and it was so strong that I didn't know if I could even go forward. And I just felt this pressure upon me, and so I did the only thing you can usually do in the midst of a spiritual attack. I cried out to God. And I literally didn't know how my life would go forward, being such a worthless person that I was in that moment. And I cried out and said, God, help me. And in that moment, as I was laying in bed, God gave me, I didn't really think it was a vision in the moment. All I could do is I began to see the story of this woman. I had read it not too long before that. And God played out into the story of this woman, only as the story was playing out in my mind, I was seeing it from her perspective. I was seeing it from behind her eyes. And it started off with me with the crowd all around me, and they were yelling, and they were shouting things at me, and they were shouting how worthless and guilty I was, and it was just oppressing. And yet even with all of that, all the anger of what was all around me, the worst part of it was the shame within. That I knew who I was. And it almost even felt like I was deserving to be punished. As much as it was frightening, I knew who I was. And I was ashamed. And that crowd took me and they brought me to a courtyard. And they threw me down at Jesus' feet. And when they did that, I was just on my knees and I couldn't even see. All I could see is his feet first because he was standing up. And I didn't even want to look up. I knew I'd heard of this man. He was some religious teacher. And I didn't want to look up at him because I was nothing. And then Jesus stooped down to my level. And he didn't look at me at first. Instead, he reached down and he wrote my name. And in that vision, I saw Miriam was written out. And that word terrified me, because that was my name. And that meant he knew me. And yet I even knew at that moment that he knew more than just my name. He knew all about me. He knew my worst secrets. He knew my weaknesses and my shame. And I just felt this fear that this man knew me. And then, still without looking at me, he reached down and he wrote down the word adultery. And it just affirmed that he knew who I was. But then he did something that was unexpected to me. He looked at me. And as he looked at me, as he was squatting there looking at me, I saw in his eyes, not condemnation, I saw compassion. And more than that, I saw a hint of a smile. And he reached out, and he brushed his hand through the dirt, and he removed that word adultery. It was gone. And I felt in that moment as if there was like a shower of water, just of cleansing that just poured over me. And a part of my spirit just soared up. It was gone. It was gone. And then he reached out and he wrote out something else I had done. And once again, he looked at me and he just wiped that away. And he did it again. And he did it again. And each time it was like a wave coming onto the shore that it would cleanse a little more. And the voices were still shouting around us. And he got up and he stood up and he dealt with them. And let him who was without sin cast the first stone. But then he came back to me. And he came back to our work in the sand because that's what was important. And he continued to do it over and over again, exposing each time, but then removing. And then when we were done, we stood up and we looked around, and they were gone. And he said, "Woman, where are they? Have you found no one to condemn you?" And I said, "No, they're not here." And he said, "Neither do I." And he said, "Then go and sin no more." And usually when I've taught on this passage, I've read this passage, and generally when I come to this part where he says, "Go and sin no more," I kind of feel like it's, okay, you got away with it this time, but you better not do anymore. And I did that not necessarily with thought of the story, but really because that's almost how I kind of looked at grace for me. That God was willing to forgive me, because God's God, but he would say, "But you better not do anymore. You better straighten up." But in that vision, that's not at all what it felt like. In that vision, he was giving me permission that I didn't have to be like that anymore. I could go and not walk in the old. But even as weak as I was, even as I was, he had a passion for me, and he was saying, "Let's go forward and let's leave that past behind." I awoke from that vision that night, and I just felt a peace upon me. For God had shown that his grace is far greater than anything I may have done or anything Satan may try, the lies he may put upon me. That he has a passion for me, and it goes beyond, I don't have to deserve it. I don't have to earn it. And I don't have to convince him of it. He's not up there going, "Oh, I gotta forgive John again, jeez." He gives us a smile and says, "It's no more. It's no more." That is the message I felt God did not only give me that night, but was the message I was supposed to share with you and with others. Because there's a lot of us who are struggling underneath the weight of guilt, of who we should be and who we're not, and we're God, and he's there, but we don't feel worthy of him using or working in us, and he so much wants us to know how passionate he is about each and every one of you. I'm going to play this through again in a little different way, and as I do this, I want you to put yourself in the position of that woman and ask, what is it he's trying to communicate to you? Guilty no more. I awoke in the night to Satan's attack, feeling crushed by a mountain of shame. I felt lost and alone, knowing not the way back, so I cried out to God's holy name. He caused in my mind for the story to rise of the woman caught in her sin. There in the vision I saw through her eyes, feeling trapped with the crowd closing in. Guilty, she's guilty, the words flew at me like stones aimed to rid me of life. I've been caught in a place I have no right to be, betraying my vows as a wife. But the anger and bile pouring out from the crowd paled to that churning inside. My shame wrapped around me a desolate shroud, as hope shriveled and died. Guilt surging up from my mortified soul for embracing the lure of sin. Though I tried to hide from my own sinful rule, still guilt found me time and again. Now in the crowd's hands being led to the slaughter, my judgment surely was near. Disowned by my family, a disgrace of a daughter, my pleas had no one to hear. We came to a stop in an open courtyard, and hands shoved me out to the front, thrown to the ground unyielding and hard, like an animal trapped by the hunt. I fell at the feet of the teacher of men, a rabbi named Jesus I'd heard. He stood above me, looking down on my sin as I lay there not speaking a word. He stooped to my level there on the ground and started to write in the dirt. He wrote out my name without speaking a sound, and my fear came to sudden alert. The name of Miriam lay bare to the sun. My soul felt completely exposed.
surely knew me and all that I'd done, my innermost shame here disclosed. Below my name in the glaring sunshine, adultery he wrote on the ground. But I blinked in surprise as his eyes locked on mine, for in them compassion I found. He gave a soft smile as he stretched out his hand, his eyes never leaving my face. He wiped out that sin written there in the sand, without leaving even one trace. I felt in that moment as if there had been blessed water poured down over me. In removing the word, he washed clean the sin, and a part of my soul lifted free. There in the dirt he wrote for display another transgression of mine. Without any pause, he wiped it away, again leaving nary a sign. Over and over he did as before, exposing then removing the sin, like redeeming waves washing over the shore, bringing healing and cleansing within. We sat there, we two, in the midst of a crowd, speaking without saying words. Voices flew round us, angry and loud, like a flock of furious birds. Jesus stood up and looked all about, until silence was finally shown. Let him without sin, Jesus called out, be the one to cast the first stone. Then he came back to me and our work in the sand, and continued to write on the ground. When finally finished, he helped me to stand, as we turned and looked all around. Woman, where are they? Jesus asked me. Do you find any condemning you? No, my Lord, there's no one I see. He said, neither do I choose to. Go now in peace and sin no more. His words touching deep within, giving hope that my life needn't be as before. I could finally be free of my sin. Grace he gave me I did not deserve, a grace powerful and free. Sweet grace from this God I imperfectly serve, this God that forever loves me.
We all deal with sin. And we all deal with failure. And a lot of times what we try to do is we try to put it behind us. We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to even bring it up. We may say, sorry, forgive me, but we don't want to deal with it. But what God says, we need to deal with it. Just like the losses that our people we need to be willing to come and share it and lay it down at Jesus' feet. We don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be afraid of him looking down with us and once again shaking his head at how much of a failure we are when we're expecting so much more. Our God is a compassion. He knows already all who you are. And what he wants you to do is help you to experience the power of his grace upon you. So I encourage you, if there's anything that you've been holding back, even if it's just anger or pride or other things we have, the more we just try to drag it along with us, the more it just drags us down. So I encourage you to bring it into the Lord, lay it down at his feet, and see what he wants to do within you, to experience the power of his grace as he loves each and every one of you so very, very much. I thank you for the opportunity to come and share this morning, and to share even what God has put on my heart that I need, that he wants to share with so many others, to say, come and experience what I have for you. If you would like to do that even this morning, now is always a good time. Now is always a good time. Wherever we're at, whenever it is, now is always the right time to do what God has called on us all.